The dense forest was unusually quiet that morning, with only the faint rustling of leaves and distant bird calls breaking the stillness. It was the kind of quiet that made Sergeant Daniel Carter uneasy. As a soldier stationed near the remote woodland base, he had grown accustomed to nature's usual symphony. But today, something felt different. Daniel was on a routine patrol when he first spotted them. Two bear cubs, small and trembling, peeked out from behind a cluster of trees. Their wide, dark eyes locked onto his, but instead of retreating as most wild animals would, they hesitated. They looked desperate. At first, Daniel thought they might have simply been curious, but then he noticed their restless pacing, their uneasy whimpers. Something was wrong. He took a cautious step forward, scanning the area for their mother. Bears were fiercely protective of their young, and the last thing he wanted was to stumble into a dangerous situation. But the mother bear was nowhere to be seen. A deep unease settled in Daniel's chest. Cubs this young wouldn't be alone unless something had gone terribly wrong. His military training kicked in, and he surveyed the area with sharp precision. That's when he saw it, a motionless figure further into the woods, partially hidden by underbrush. His pulse quickened. The cubs weren't just lost. They were trying to lead him somewhere. Something inside him, an instinct beyond logic, urged him to follow. As he moved closer, the cubs let out tiny, pleading cries, their small bodies quivering with urgency. Daniel had no idea what he was about to find, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn away. Daniel's boots crunched softly against the forest floor as he followed the cubs deeper into the trees. His heart pounded with anticipation. The little bears kept glancing back at him, their anxious eyes pleading for him to hurry. Then, through the thick underbrush, he saw her. A full-grown mother bear lay on her side, barely moving. Her massive body heaved with shallow breaths, and a deep gash ran along her front leg, dark with dried blood. Daniel stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He had encountered wild animals before, but never like this, never with such a palpable sense of desperation. The cubs rushed to her side, nuzzling against her fur, letting out tiny, distressed whimpers. The mother bear opened her eyes weakly, as if acknowledging them, but she couldn't even lift her head. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to be cautious. A wounded animal, especially a bear, could be unpredictable. But as he looked into her half-lidded eyes, he didn't see aggression. He saw exhaustion, pain, a silent plea. He dropped to one knee, staying just out of reach. "You're hurt," he murmured, more to himself than to the bear. His mind raced. How had this happened? A poacher's trap? A fight with another predator? Whatever the cause, one thing was clear. She wouldn't survive without help. The cubs whined, circling him, nudging his hands as if urging him to do something. His heart clenched at their innocence. They had no idea how close they were to losing their mother. Daniel exhaled, making a decision. He grabbed his radio. "Base, this is Carter," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I have an injured bear out in Sector 3. It's bad. I need backup. Medical supplies, anything we can spare." Static crackled before a voice replied. "Carter, did you just say a bear?" "Affirmative. And she's got cubs. They need help." There was a pause, then a sigh. "Copy that. Stand by." Daniel turned his attention back to the bear. Her breathing was labored, and he noticed the way her flank rose and fell unevenly. He needed to act fast. His training had prepared him for battlefield wounds, but not for treating a wild animal. Still, the basics were the same: stop the bleeding, prevent infection, stabilize. He shrugged off his pack and pulled out a canteen. Slowly, carefully, he poured a trickle of water near the bear's muzzle. She barely reacted, but when a drop touched her tongue, she gave a weak flicker of movement. Encouraged, he poured a little more. "Come on, girl," he murmured. "Stay with me." The cubs watched closely, their tiny faces full of trust. They knew he was helping. Minutes felt like hours as Daniel did what he could. He cleaned the wound as best as possible, using strips of his own shirt to wrap around the worst of the gash. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility pressing on his chest. He had faced combat, had saved men under fire, but this was different. This was a mother fighting for her life, and for the lives of the two cubs who depended on her. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke the silence. Help had arrived. Daniel looked down at the bear one more time, hoping she could hold on just a little longer. "We've got you," he whispered. And for the first time since he had found her, the mother bear's eyes met his, not with fear, but with something that almost felt like understanding. The mother bear, whom Daniel had begun calling Mura, had survived the night. Thanks to the quick medical attention from the base's wildlife team, her wound was cleaned and dressed, and though she was weak, she was alive. Her cubs never strayed far, curling against her as she rested in the makeshift shelter the rescue team had set up. But what truly surprised everyone wasn't just Mara's resilience. It was the reaction of another unexpected visitor. Ranger, a military working dog from the base, had been brought along with the medics for security. A German shepherd with a strong sense of duty, Ranger was trained for search and rescue missions, tracking, and even combat situations. He was sharp, disciplined, and loyal. And now, he was absolutely fascinated by the bear. Daniel had expected Ranger to keep his distance or even growl in warning. But instead, the dog had been strangely calm around the injured mother. He had watched quietly as the medics worked on her, his ears perking at the sound of the whimpering cubs. And when Mara finally lifted her head for the first time, blinking groggily, Ranger had taken a slow, cautious step forward. Daniel had been about to call him back when something unexpected happened. Mara didn't snarl. She didn't flinch. Instead, she simply looked at Ranger, long and steady, as if assessing him. The two creatures, so vastly different, locked eyes in a silent exchange. The tension that Daniel had anticipated never came. There was no fear, no hostility, just understanding. The cubs, perhaps sensing that Ranger wasn't a threat, were the first to act. The bolder of the two, a little male Daniel had nicknamed Scout, toddled forward, sniffing curiously. Ranger lowered his head, his tail giving a hesitant wag. When Scout let out a small, playful chuff, Ranger responded by gently nudging the cub with his nose. Daniel could hardly believe it. Over the next few days, as Mara regained her strength, Ranger became an unexpected guardian, not just for the cubs, but for the mother as well. He never strayed too far, always keeping a watchful eye on them. And though the base personnel remained cautious, it became clear that Mara trusted Ranger in a way that defied logic. One evening, Daniel watched as Ranger approached the resting bear once again. Mara, now able to lift her head without struggle, observed him with quiet curiosity. And then, to Daniel's complete shock, she made a sound, low, almost like a deep rumble, but not aggressive. It was acceptance. Ranger took that as permission and lay down a few feet away. The cubs, delighted, wobbled over to snuggle against his fur. Daniel let out a slow breath, shaking his head in amazement. It wasn't just about survival anymore. This was something deeper, a bond, an unspoken friendship that had formed between a predator and a protector. And somehow, against all odds, it made sense. The unlikely bond between Mara, her cubs, and Ranger fascinated everyone at the base, but it wasn't without its challenges. Though the mother bear had accepted Ranger's presence, she was still a wild animal, and trusting humans, even those who had saved her, was another matter entirely. Mara remained wary of people. While she allowed Daniel and the wildlife medics to tend to her wound, she never let them get too close unless absolutely necessary. The cubs, on the other hand, were naturally curious. They would toddle after Ranger, trailing him across the enclosed recovery area, even venturing near Daniel when he sat quietly with them. Mara would watch these interactions with a mix of protectiveness and hesitation, sometimes letting out a low warning chuff if she felt they were too close. One evening, the first real test of their bond came. A sudden storm swept through the area, rain slamming against the trees and wind howling through the base. The loud cracks of thunder sent the cubs into a frenzy of distress, their tiny bodies shaking as they pressed against Mara for comfort. But the mother bear was struggling herself. Injured and weak, she was unable to move quickly, and the sounds of the storm clearly unsettled her. That's when Ranger stepped in. Without hesitation, The German shepherd laid down beside the cubs, his presence solid and unwavering. He let out a soft whine, then nuzzled one of them gently, as if to say, "You're safe." Scout, the bolder cub, responded first, climbing onto Ranger's side, burying his tiny face in the dog's fur. The other cub soon followed, their trembling bodies gradually settling. Mara, watching closely, let out a slow breath and rested her head down. She was still cautious, but she didn't pull her cubs away. Daniel, observing the moment from the doorway, smiled. The next obstacle came as Mara grew stronger. She had spent weeks recovering in the care of the base's wildlife team. But soon, the reality set in. She would need to be released back into the wild. And when that day came, she would have to part ways with Ranger. Daniel worried about how Ranger would handle the separation. The dog had taken on a protective role, standing guard over the cubs and even sharing meals with them. The bond they had formed was undeniable. But the biggest surprise came when it was Mara who seemed reluctant to leave. On the morning of her planned release, the medics opened the gate to the transport enclosure, expecting the bear to head straight for the tree line. But instead, Mara hesitated. She turned back, her dark eyes settling on Ranger. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, in an act that stunned everyone, Mara stepped forward and nudged Ranger gently with her massive head. It wasn't a goodbye filled with sadness, it was gratitude. And with that, she gathered her cubs and disappeared into the forest. Ranger sat watching the tree line long after she had gone. Daniel crouched beside him, giving him a comforting pat. "You did good, buddy," he murmured. "Real good." Ranger let out a quiet sigh before finally turning back toward the base. His job here was done, but the bond they had shared, that would never be forgotten. Several weeks had passed since Mara and her cubs had been released back into the wild. Though Ranger had adjusted to life without them, Daniel could tell the dog still missed them. On their routine patrols near the forest's edge, Ranger would often stop, ears perked, nose twitching, as if hoping to catch a familiar scent. Then one evening, something happened that neither Daniel nor Ranger expected. A distress call came through from the perimeter team. "Carter, we've got unusual activity near the base fence. Possible large animal. Can you check it out?" Daniel grabbed his gear and Ranger's leash, though he doubted he'd need it. The dog was already on high alert, his body tense with a quiet urgency Daniel had only seen in life-or-death situations. As they reached the tree line, Ranger suddenly pulled ahead, his nose to the ground. He whined, then barked, a sharp, urgent sound. And then Daniel saw them. Mara and her cubs stood just beyond the fence, but something was wrong. Mara's posture was tense, her body slightly hunched. The cubs huddled close to her, frightened. That's when Daniel spotted the threat. A pair of hungry-looking wolves circling the mother bear with predatory patience. Mara was weak from her past injury, and the cubs were still too young to fight. She could hold them off for a while, but the odds weren't in her favor. Ranger didn't hesitate. Before Daniel could stop him, the German shepherd bolted forward, barking with fierce determination. His sudden presence startled the wolves, who turned their attention toward him. Ranger growled low in his throat, his stance firm, as if daring them to try something. Mara, recognizing her old companion, gathered her strength and let out a powerful roar. The wolves hesitated. One took a step back, and then, realizing they were outmatched, they turned and slunk into the shadows. Silence fell over the clearing. Daniel exhaled slowly, gripping his radio. Perimeter is secure. No threat to the base. Mara locked eyes with Ranger. And then, in an unexpected moment of trust, she lowered her head and let out a deep, almost affectionate huff. The cubs, encouraged, bounded forward and nuzzled against the dog like they had in the past. Ranger responded in kind, wagging his tail, licking Scout on the nose. Daniel watched the exchange, his heart swelling. This wasn't just a random meeting. It was proof that their bond hadn't been broken by time or distance. Mara and her cubs didn't linger long. But before they disappeared into the woods again, Mara turned one last time, holding Ranger's gaze. It wasn't just gratitude. It was recognition. They were family. And no matter how wild the world was, that would never change. In the days that followed, Daniel often found himself thinking back to that night in the clearing. The moment when Ranger and Mara had reunited, proving that their bond had never truly faded. It was a rare kind of connection, one that defied instinct and logic, yet existed so clearly between them. Though Mara and her cubs had returned to the wild where they belonged, Daniel knew they weren't truly gone. On some mornings, he would find fresh paw prints near the base's perimeter, a silent reminder that they were still out there, watching. And every now and then, Ranger would lift his head, ears twitching, as if sensing something familiar in the distance. One evening, as Daniel sat outside the barracks with Ranger beside him, he glanced toward the forest. The setting sun bathed the treetops in gold, casting long shadows across the clearing. "Think she'll come back again?" he mused, scratching behind Ranger's ears. The German shepherd let out a soft sigh, resting his head on his paws, but his tail thumped once against the ground, as if he already knew the answer. Daniel smiled. What had started as an act of survival had turned into something far greater. It was a reminder that compassion knew no boundaries, that even the most unlikely of friendships could form in the unlikeliest of places. And somewhere deep in the forest, a mother bear and her cubs carried with them the same knowledge. That kindness, once given, was never truly forgotten. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Daniel felt a quiet peace settle over him. No matter what the future held, he knew one thing for certain. Their paths had crossed for a reason. And in the wild, in the silence of the trees, some bonds would always remain.